This week on the podcast, I am joined by Dr. David Weiss, who is both a bridge player and writer, but also a retired professor of psychology who specializes in expertise. And so he was someone I really wanted to talk to. So, David, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me about your academic background and how expertise became the subject of study.
I am in a psychology department, and I typically taught statistics classes. Because I was a bridge player before I was a psychologist, I adopted bridge player hours. So I often taught classes in the evening. So one semester back in the 70s, I was teaching statistics in the evening. Now, statistics classes are necessary for psychologists, but they're not beloved. And a neighbor class had lots of laughter going on, and I didn't understand why. My students were not laughing much. So I wandered over after the class and talked to the instructor of that class. And it turned out my colleague was a serious psychologist, but he was also a wine aficionado. And he offered a class called Sensory Appreciation of Wine. Now, when I heard what he was doing, I couldn't take it all that seriously, but he said, no, this is really serious stuff. And I'm teaching them valuable things that they care about. So I said, well, are they learning anything? He said, of course. I said, well, how can we tell? And this led to me setting up an experiment. I decided to find out how much they knew at the beginning of the class and how much they knew at the end. So the problem with measuring how much they've learned is, how do you know what they've learned? I decided that the way to do this was to have them judge how good wines were. So I went to Trader Joe's, now this is the 70s, remember, and they were happy to cooperate with an educational venture. So they gave me some wine of varying prices, a wide span. I even asked them if they could give me a spoiled wine. So I had a bunch of wines, and I got black glasses, and I served them to the students. So they did this twice at the beginning of the semester, once in one order and the second time in a different order. The instructor also sampled the wines, and he gave a rating. Okay, so what did the ratings look like? Well, they were distributed kind of all over the scale, so that was good. It meant that they were noticing that the wines were different. But something peculiar emerged. When they rated a wine a second time, there was essentially no connection between the rating of the first sip and the rating of the second sip. Okay, so I looked at the data and how to evaluate them. I mean, I don't know whether their judgments are correct. So there's two possibilities. One is that we can say the instructor is correct. If your ratings are like his, then you're doing a good job evaluating. But that's dubious, because how do we know that the instructor is good? So I looked for more fundamental properties, and this is where the science came in. I said, in order to be judging expertly, you have to do two things. You have to be able to tell that the wines are different. We call that discrimination, giving different ratings to different wines. But you also have to be consistent. If you get the same wine twice, you ought to give it the same rating. If you don't do that, you're not behaving expertly. So if you take two measures, a measure of discrimination and a measure of consistency, and put them in a ratio, you have a measure of judgmental expertise that's independent of knowing what the right answers are. Now, I thought this was a pretty big deal, and it turns out it is. The instructor was great in terms of my criteria, and that ratio between discrimination and consistency. He was great at the beginning and the end. The students were lousy at the beginning, but that was to be expected. However, they were also lousy at the end. Now, I asked them, what'd you learn in this class? And they said, I learned to judge wines. I'm really happy about it. They viewed this as a very positive experience. But they didn't learn how to judge the difference between wine. What did they learn? Well, they learned to do wine talk. They could say, it has a hint of raspberries. I love that phrase. So that was my beginning to the study of expertise. And I realized it's a difficult problem. We live our lives dependent upon the contributions of experts. If a guy builds a bridge, he better build it right. If a doctor takes care of me, she better know what she's doing. But we don't have very good ways to evaluate them because in most cases, there's no scoreboard. There's no way to say you're doing a good job. How do people get certified as experts? In most domains, expertise is conferred by degrees and experience. And indeed, if you needed an expert, suppose you went to a strange town and you felt ill, you wanted to get a doctor, how would you find an expert doctor? The answer I come up with is very unsatisfactory. I go online and look up doctors. But I don't have any sense that I've found a good doctor.
I might look at their credentials. Oh, this one went to Harvard, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything.
Well, that's a good criterion, though. You could say, well, Harvard surely wouldn't put out any bad doctors. And you might be right about that. But you don't have any, what we would like to call performance evidence. You've not seen them do a great job. You don't know about anybody who had a case like yours who they treated successfully. So you're kind of stuck. And you have to use these, I'll call them weak criteria for finding an expert. But when you have lots of time, you can do better. You can evaluate experts on the basis of performance. And so my research has adopted a performance-based perspective. Behavioral scientists believe in looking at behavior. So we are empirically oriented. We want to find evidence that supports expertise. In some domains, that's easy. One of the domains we'll look at later, free throwing. It's easy to see who's the best free thrower. You just count their percentage of success. It's easy to see who's the best runner. You look at the stopwatch. Beyond those sorts, it's quite difficult because there's no score that you can look at. And even if there is, like say you look at how well someone does in a tennis tournament. Now, I've won a tennis tournament in my life, but I'm not a very good tennis player, I can tell you that. Why did I win the tournament? I played against other lousy players. Doesn't mean I'm good in any real sense. Now, I was pleased to see when you interviewed Brian Platnick that he had the same perspective. He says you got to look at performance. But he didn't realize how complicated it is. Performance in bridge is contingent on lots of things. You have not only how well you make decisions, but you got three other people. Sometimes all three of them are working against you. Your expertise is confounded by what the other guys do. It's also challenging to measure because, well, every hand is different. So we can't say that you're doing a hand well because we don't know how you would do on other hands that are similar but not exactly the same. We don't really know whether you've done well. Maybe you made your contract, but maybe you should have made an extra trick. You have to make arbitrary decisions when you want to score players' performance. And that's always risky because your arbitrary decisions might be wrong. An expert, it's not a matter of saying someone is an expert or they're not an expert. That's too simplistic a view. It's really relative. You can be a very fine player, like I was in that tennis tournament I won. But if I played against a good player, you'd soon find out I'm not really an expert. It's all relative. It depends who you compare to. In bridge, it's easy for you to compare yourself to the best. You get an opportunity to do that.
So if I asked you to put together a test to see who's an expert and who's not, or there's a continuum, where do you fall on this? What would that test look like?
We can obviously do something like you did in school, where you were tested on what you had learned. Do you know it now? So I could give you card combinations and see if you get them right. I could give you hands to bid and see whether you did them right. But wait a minute, what does that mean? How do we know what's the right bid? Well, typically, to decide what's the right bid, we have nothing better to do than rely upon consensus. And so the bridge world pioneered this idea of using consensus to define the best bid. Unfortunately, that's a really poor way to judge right answers. It's astonishing how bad that is.
Why is it so bad?
Well, let me tell you a story. Okay, I was involved in a panel after 9/11, where we had a grant from the Department of Homeland Security, and we were concerned with, can we defend against future attacks? There was a concern that they were going to attack the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, which do an enormous amount of our shipping. It would be a catastrophe if these ports were destroyed. But everything costs money, and you have to decide how likely is it that there will be an attack on one of these ports? Is it enough to justify spending a bunch of money to build up defenses? Well, nobody knows what the likelihood is that they will attack. So what did we do? We gathered together a panel of, it was about 25 people who were supposed to be experts on, well, I'm not sure what they were experts on. Security. I was one of them. I knew nothing about security, but I knew something about decision making and using the past to predict the future, which is one of the crucial things that experts do. There was a moderator who said, okay, we're going to estimate the probability that within the next 5 years, the bad guys are going to attack the Long Beach port. What do you think that probability is? So there was some silence, and then people answered. Now you might wonder, they don't really know, do they? But you got to answer, because if you don't answer, you're not an expert, and you're not going to get paid. So everybody answered. The highest answer was, the probability was 95%. My answer was 0. Why 0? Because I predict the future from the past. There's never been an attack on a Los Angeles port. So I said the probability 0. Now, people didn't like that answer because it means there's no need for the panel. But that's what I thought the answer was. There was a great disparity across the room. What should the moderator do? He needed an answer. You can't come back from a meeting like this and say, we don't know. So he averaged the opinions. That was pretty easy, and it was justifiable. What else could you do? So there we had an answer from a panel of, quote, experts that was based on consensus. Now, your opinion, I can see it on your face, is like mine was. This answer is worth nothing. But that's what consensus does for you. Now, of course, in the bridge examples, the consensus is usually better than that. There's more agreement. But, they pick the problems, in the bridge world at least, they pick the problems in order to generate non-consensus. If there was complete consensus, the problem would be trivial.
Isn't part of being better than other people doing things that
Exactly.
aren't consensus?
That's just the point. Consensus is a lousy criterion. But what's better? Well, one answer would be pick the greatest expert you know and use that person's answers as the gold standard. That's one possibility. For play problems, it's easier because you can look at the outcome. Again, it's not a guaranteed gold standard because there's random elements of how the cards are distributed. You might take the best play and it doesn't work. So how do you decide it was the best play? Well, you can compute percentages, but really great players will sometimes see things that the percentages don't suggest. So it's a difficult problem. Measurement in general is the hardest thing that researchers have to cope with. It's really hard to measure things well when you don't have obvious ways to do that.
Like, how do you study expertise without that? You need some sort of rubric.
That's why I developed my measure that doesn't use gold standards. It doesn't use right answers. Consistency and discrimination. Those are key properties of judgment that you have to be able to do. I've never done it with bridge because people say, well, you can't be too consistent or you'll be predictable. That might be true. This is an area that is very difficult to work with.
So are you saying that if I present an expert with, say, a declare play problem, that's a difficult problem and they come up with a solution, and I present the same problem to them a couple months later, long enough ago that they've forgotten, one of the definitions of an expert is that they should come to exactly the same conclusion?
Yes. Well, let's not say definition.
Okay.
Let's say a criterion. Not quite the same thing.
Right.
But they ought to be consistent. Now, consistency by itself isn't worth anything. You could always give the same dumb answer time after time. But you have to have discrimination and consistency at the same time. Now, duplicate bridge was a great invention. Before that, you judged bridge expertise by how much money you won playing rubber bridge. That's clearly a bad measure because the randomness of the cards has a huge effect. Duplicate is much better, and we're way ahead of other comparable games when it comes to measuring expertise.
What about something like Challenge the Champs in the bridge world, where a partnership is presented with a pair of hands, and there is like, this is a better contract than that?
Right. So that's a good way to judge how well the partnership is bidding.
Because it's so measurable.
Well, yes, because it's measurable. And so that is a good index of bidding performance. How far it goes in terms of actual bidding performance is not so clear because in modern bridge, the opponents never shut up and you don't get to have these pure constructive auctions nearly as often as they appear all the problems are slams. In Challenge the Champs, it's always slams because that's where you see the differences emerge. But slams are especially difficult because you have to locate particular features. And I don't think they test for what wins in ordinary games. Successfully competing for part scores is, I believe, the hardest part and the most crucial part where experts and non-experts have a difference. Nobody bids slams very well. Even people using the most sophisticated systems have lousy batting averages, but they'll kill you in part scores.
So whether it's bridge or, any other endeavor, aside from the idea of measuring expertise, let's just grant that there is such a thing, and most people aren't there, and everyone who is an expert at some point wasn't there and got better to the point that they are now an expert. So how does that process work?
Skill acquisition.
Yes.
A subject which has been studied a lot, not by me, but has been studied a lot, and we know some things about it. There are a couple of ways that people acquire skills. The one that's probably most relevant to bridge is you get teaching. Someone starts out teaching you the rules, teaching you the basics. The person who does that doesn't have to be an expert. I suspect most of the instruction in bridge is not aimed at experts. It's aimed at getting you from I don't know how to play to I can play bridge now. The step above that is a bigger step and a harder step. And I don't know if there are people who are qualified to teach that. There are many people who are qualified to teach you how to play. Just as there are many people who are qualified to teach you how to drive, but there aren't many people who are going to teach you how to win a Formula One race. It's a much different kind of skill to pass along. And we don't know very much about how you do that. The general path of skill acquisition is as you described. People start, they don't know how to do it. They get better and better. And at some point, they reach their pinnacle. They level off. Almost none get beyond that. Mostly that you get to your level, you stay at your level, and then eventually as the various things that aging does affect you, you come down. Now, this is a good time to talk about a popular mythology, the 1,000-hour rule, sometimes called the 10-year rule.
Yeah.
This was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell, who's a wonderful science writer, but he doesn't always know what he's talking about. But he can make you feel like you've learned it. Whatever it is he wants to teach you, he does so. I mean, he's really good at his job.
This influenced my thinking a lot
Yeah.
about what talent is, what expertise is. So,
Unfortunately, there's a lot of nonsense in there. First of all, the work that he's citing was primarily done by a psychologist named Anders Ericsson. He's gone now, but he was quite knowledgeable and famous for his work. But he did something kind of odd, something that I think most people would do, but it's odd. He says, I want to see what makes experts. So he studied experts. And we asked them, how'd you get to be so good? And almost invariably, they said, I practiced. The problem is that doesn't tell you anything about whether practice makes you an expert. You have to look at who practiced, but didn't get better. He only interviewed the experts. He interviewed expert musicians, for example. And they all say, I practiced a lot. Well, I'm sure that's true. But it doesn't mean that if you decide to become a violinist and you practice a lot, you're going to be a great violinist. In fact, the odds are extremely against that happening. You can practice till you're blue, and if you don't have much talent, you're not going to be an expert at it.
didn't that violinist study say that the ones who were better had practiced more?
Yeah, and I don't think it's true. One of the problems you have is self-selection. Suppose you practice, and you realize, I'm just not as good as that other guy. What do? Well, you give up, or you settle, and you stay at your level. The ones who made it to the top practice. But that doesn't mean that if you practice, you'll make it to the top. You need something beyond that. You need what we call it's kind of ineffable. You need talent. And it doesn't necessarily take a lot of practice to become an expert. That's the other side of this coin. I mean, we have examples in music. Mozart was writing, I'm not a music guy, but I know he was writing great music when he was 6.
Mozart's an example in one of these books. I think this is in the book called Talent is Overrated, which has also influenced me. And he kind of says, Mozart, Tiger Woods, yeah, they were doing a lot of things when they were 6, but it wasn't until they were 16 that they really did anything world class. And they did put those 10 years in. They just started really.
Well, it's just not true.
I've been talking to a lot of people, and one of the things that has been a consistent thread in this is that they all started before their teenage years.
Some who started then became these guys.
Yeah.
Others who started then became you.
Of course. Yeah.
It's just, it's not a guaranteed pathway.
So I would assume, right, my layman's takeaway from that would be that some study is different than other study. Some practice is better than other practice. And it's not just the amount of practice, but the quality of it.
That was Anders Ericsson's big thing.
Right. Deliberate practice.
Deliberate practice.
And are you saying that's nonsense?
It's not. It's real. Let's say it's slippery.
Okay.
You can't tell whether the practice was deliberate until after you see the result. He would say, well, they didn't do it right. They just didn't practice right.
So there are these tennis academies, Bollettieri.
Yeah.
And all of the best juniors go to one of these academies. They're all getting presumably, the same sort of coaching and mentorship. And one of them turns into Pete Sampras and another one doesn't.
Right.
So what's the differentiator? Is it how much he worked, the quality of his work, or just that he's Pete Sampras and he was always going to rise to the top?
That's what I think.
You think it's
number three? He wasn't always going to rise to the top. He needed to have the circumstances available that allowed him to nurture this tennis ability. But he was born with it, and I wasn't. I don't have the coordination. I don't have the foot speed. All of those abilities.
So is your takeaway for me that I'm just not good enough somewhere deep down in my bones and I shouldn't even bother?
No, that isn't it. You can get better, but unfortunately, we all have a ceiling. It's more obvious when you look at physical sports because you can see, look at that guy swing. His feet are out of position. You can't see that in bridge. You can't learn something just by looking at the experts. So we'd like to know what were the antecedents of someone's expertise. That's what he's doing. It's what I call the milk drinker fallacy. I have a young criminologist who's studying. He wants to know what are the common origins of criminals? What do criminals have in common so that maybe we can identify criminals early enough to intervene? So he goes to a prison and he asks them some questions. And what he finds out is that everybody in the prison drank milk as a child. So he concludes milk drinking leads to crime. I think that's what Ericsson did. You can't just study experts. You have to study experts in concert with studying non-experts.
And specifically the ones who kind of washed out, who put in the same amount of effort and didn't make it.
It's looking at half the picture.
Right.
You can't do that. And of course, there's no access to the people who didn't make it to the top. So studying them is really challenging. You have to start off with a cohort where everybody gets the same treatment.
All right, let's talk about free throws. How did you choose free throws as a statistic to the study?
Free throws are clean, one of the cleanest performance measures I know. The player who gets the ball the most is going to score the most. And if he has a weak defender, he'll score more. And if he is an assistee rather than an assister, he'll score more. You can't just look at how many points people score. You can't even look at the percentage of shots made because the defense has a role to play here. But free throws, there's nothing in the way. It's pure performance, uncontaminated by anything.
Bridge, I would think the closest corollary would be like a declaring only sort of contest. Like the auction's the same, the defense is the same. It's just your declarer skill.
I agree with you. That's the cleanest. But it's also only one phase of the game, as free throws are. So you can't tell if someone's a great free thrower, they're not necessarily a great basketball player, and vice versa. Here we can see that. This graph shows two NBA stars. They were in the league for many years, and neither of them could shoot. I could shoot free throws better than they could. I could shoot free throws at 70% in high school. These guys are under, in some cases, way under. And this is their career. They're getting paid
Sure.
to do this.
NBA players shooting 40% free throws.
Well, SO is Shaquille O'Neal, Ben Wallace is BW. These were stars,
Hall of Famers.
Hall of Famers. They had really long careers, even though they couldn't shoot free throws, because that's only one component. Being an expert in most fields requires multiple expertises. In bridge, we know what they are. In basketball, you have to be able to shoot, you have to be able to defend, you have to pass, and so on, rebound. Different expertises. Being a professional basketball player generally selects for people who are high in all of those. But occasionally, someone will be so good at some phases that they can get by even though they're terrible at other phases. And here, these guys' free throws suggest that they just can't do it. Had years and years, they had expensive coaches. They had coaches who were yelling at them that you've got to do this better. You're costing us games. But we see that they didn't improve very much. And if we go to the next free throw slide, we'll see something else that's even more interesting. Okay, so these are other all-time greats. These are different guys. I don't know if you'll recognize the initials.
I'm guessing there's Magic Johnson in there and LeBron, maybe Michael Jordan.
These are famous basketball. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, again, all-time greats. And notice their great curves over their years in the NBA stay mostly flat. They reach a plateau and they stay at it. This is the general course of skill acquisition in most domains. Now, we've seen these guys they've gotten to where they are when they're in the NBA. So they've had plenty of practice before they got here. But when they're in the NBA, the practice is more crucial. They're getting paid to do this, and the coaches are teaching them as best they can. But you can see it doesn't make much difference. You just don't change over years in the NBA. You have your level and you stick to it.
And a lot of these guys spent hours every week just shooting free throws.
Yeah, they were ordered to. Shaquille O'Neal, they invented the hack-a-Shaq so that they would foul him and he would be a liability because of his. And the coach, couldn't stand it and he said, practice, practice, practice. But it didn't help. He didn't get better.
Why?
Well, Erickson would say his practice wasn't sufficiently deliberate. I would say I don't believe that. O'Neal would certainly say he practiced with all the characteristics that go into deliberate practice. He cared, he had good instruction, he didn't do it mindlessly, and all the stuff you say. He did it. Couldn't make a free throw.
So you would say that something just inherent in him physically or whatever couldn't do this?
And it's not just him. I mean, he's an obvious example because he's so terrible. But if you look at the other guys, the guys who are 70%, they'd like to be 80%.
Sure.
But they don't. They don't get there.
It's shocking.
That's why I love this graph.
So it leads me to a question. Michael Jordan was famous for first at the gym, last to leave, putting in all this work. And, looking at this chart, he stayed pretty consistent in the 80 to 90% free throw range. Do you think all of that work he did was necessary to maintain that? Because it clearly wasn't making him better. So what's the point of practice?
That's a difficult question. Do you need to practice to maintain your level? I don't know the answer to that. But the question I'm answering is whether additional practice will make you go higher than your level. That one I think I know the answer to.
I mean, I'm thinking of a concert pianist who spends 6 hours a day practicing. And your contention is that they're not getting any better with all of that work, which seems reasonable to me, that if they're already at the pinnacle.
Well, they're already at their level. The one who's at the top is at the top. I mean, there are a lot of people who are very, very good. They're in the 90th percentile rather than the 98th percentile. They're still performing at a high level, but they're not going to jump. Their level won't jump.
Okay. There's a separate skill that a lot of the people I've been talking to have mentioned, which is some sort of affective skill, some sort of concentration, focus, some mental thing that, you're performing to the best of your ability consistently. Is that a trait that you see in expertise? We talk about it in athletes in terms of like being a prime time player, or the pressure's on and this is a pressure player. Is that a real thing?
Yeah, I think it is. And experts have to concentrate. I mean, you just can't do things well on autopilot. And expert bridge players, I think that's one of those ineffables that we ascribe to them. They can concentrate better than you and I. They'll bring their attention all the time. One of the things I focus on in my writing is treat every card you play as a critical moment. It's easy to say that, but it's hard to do it.
So let's take me versus Mextroth, right? He is on anyone's short list of the best bridge player of all time, and I'm pretty good. What separates us, and how much do you think is bridge knowledge, experience, and what percentage of it is focus, concentration, whatever that X factor is? I have a feeling that he certainly knows more than I do about bridge, but I'm guessing that is not the huge differentiator.
It is not. It's being
Yeah.
able to apply it in the moment, under the gun, as it were. I probably have more knowledge than he does because I read a lot,
Yeah.
but I can't bring it into the game.
So how does one work on that skill? How does one practice that?
I'd like to say there's an easy answer, but I don't know what it is. This exercise of treat every card as though it's a critical moment. If you could do that, that might be a pathway to help, but I don't have any evidence to support my contention. I believe it, and I feel like when I tell myself to do it, I make the best play more often. I stop and tell myself, don't just play that card that looks obvious. Stop and think, what are the hands? The problem is that bridge is a timed event, which kind of ruins it for people who aren't super fast thinkers. There are only a few really great players who play quickly, really quickly. Mextros, one of them, Alan Sontag's another. There are just a few of those. They have a huge advantage. It's just their brains are wired better than ours. They can make things go faster. It's the same thing that allows somebody to hit the fastball. I can't hit a fastball. I just can't get myself to follow the ball that quickly. It's like you and Mextros.
Yeah. He sees more than I do, but he doesn't take a board off. He doesn't take a card off.
The place you can improve, definitely improve, is in what do I play now?
Right.
Stop before you play it. At least at tricks 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
Be really into that decision.
That's what I'm really now interested in, is studying how to improve that part of the game, because that seems like the differentiator.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to study squeezes, for example.
No.
That's largely a waste of time.
Yeah.
You have to say, what is my plan on this hand? That's where the money is.
Going back to tennis for a moment, because that's obviously something both of us love. From my perspective, Djokovic is not great because he can hit shots other people can't, right? All these professional tennis players can hit these shots.
Yeah.
It's about hitting them more consistently and more consistently on the big points.
Yeah.
Is that your...
Again, he treats every shot as a critical moment. He doesn't take plays off.
Yeah.
Maybe starting to a little now. I mean, it's very hard to do that.
Yeah, there comes a point where your skill in whatever your domain is kind of as good as it's going to get, and then what differentiates is how often you perform at the top of your game.
Can you bring it when you need it? It's not necessarily the crucial thing. The crucial thing is, how high level do you get to? You got to get to a high enough level if you want to become a world-class player. And some people have that and some people don't. But if you do have it, you still have to bring that focus every time, all the time. And no one does that. Everyone has lapses.
Is that something you've been able to study?
Only observationally, which I don't trust very much. Anecdotal evidence is sometimes all you have, but it isn't very good evidence. There's very little scientific study of bridge. The only paper I'm familiar with was done in 1987, a psychologist named Gideon Curran. Experts and, I don't want to call them non-experts, but lesser players who were playing at a tournament somewhere in was in the Netherlands. And what they had to do was they were given their hand at an auction, and they had to decide how likely is this contract to make. They didn't see the other hands. And he asked them to give a probability estimate for how likely this hand was to make. And he found that the experts were better at it than the non-experts. They use a funny statistic called calibration. The experts were better calibrated. Calibrated is how you evaluate weather forecasts. You can't evaluate weather forecasts on whether they're right or wrong because base rates get in the way. What they do is they say, on days when they predict, say, a 40% chance of rain, it rains 40% of the time. If you can do that, then you're well calibrated. And the experts were better calibrated than the non-experts. That's the only study I'm aware of where somebody actually looked at a skill that's slightly relevant to actual bridge, using actual bridge players as the subjects.
Interesting.
It's slightly relevant because if you think a contract will fail and you're a defender, you should double it. So it's you want to know whether it will fail, and if you think the contract is going to fail, maybe you shouldn't bid it. So this prediction ability is important, but it's something. It's a good study. I don't know of anyone else who's studied bridge players per se.
So, a few things I'm taking away from this conversation, David. Some of them are encouraging and some are discouraging.
The reality, it's such a pain.
It's encouraging to know that the top players make mistakes. We all know that. And that they take plays off. But it's discouraging to think no matter how much I work, I have a ceiling.
You have a ceiling in terms of your ability. There's some things you're just never going to see. You won't think of them. But there's no ceiling on concentration.
Right.
I found each has an effect on concentration. But it's a minimal effect, and you can fight it. But it does. I mean, Hammond is still winning things.
He is.
And so there's a model for us, not just because he's a great player, but because he's a great player at 87.
But the more I talk to people, the more I have come to believe that the differentiator is just showing up at the table at your best and getting the best out of your skill. And I just can't figure out how to work on it.
It's the easiest thing in the world to say. The message of my book is treating each play as crucial. And that's the Swiss match format pioneered by the bridge world is very good for that. The hands are not complicated in the sense that you got to work out some squeeze after 10 tricks. Almost always the issue is decided by the first 3 tricks.
So for the people out there who are at the beginner intermediate level and they're trying to get better, maybe they want to graduate from the gold rush or they want to become an expert. They're never going to be world class, but they want to become an expert. What is your expert advice on how to get better, how to acquire these skills effectively and efficiently?
Efficiently, books are the most efficient means to, or reading in general is the most efficient way to improve, because if you wait for lesson hands to come up, you wait a long time between them. Just playing does not improve your knowledge efficiently. You don't get enough instructive hands. Playing, though, is necessary to improve your concentration. That's where you can practice concentrating. So reading will improve your technical ability. Playing will improve your concentration, but only if you treat the play seriously. You have to concentrate when you play. I think the formula for that is this is a crucial play. You have to keep saying that to yourself. This is a crucial moment. If you get good enough at doing that, it won't necessarily take long.
How important do you think having a teacher or a mentor is as you're getting better?
I think it's extremely helpful. People who don't have that opportunity should definitely read. It depends on whether the live instructor can create the circumstances where there's something new for you to learn efficiently enough. Books do that automatically. You don't put something in a book unless it's an interesting situation.
It shocks me the number of top players that I talk to who said they've never read a bridge book.
Yeah, Mextroth's one of them.
Yeah.
Although I don't really believe him since he wrote a bridge book.
Well, David, thank you so much. This has been enlightening, and it's really nice to base some of this in science. Bridge players only know from our limited experience, and so talking to an academic who's really studied this just gives it a whole different level.
Well, I wish I could have studied bridge more in my academic career, but you're paid to publish. Publishing about bridge is not going to do it.
Yeah. Well, you've given me a lot of things to think about, and I appreciate that.
It's been a pleasure chatting.